Wait a minute, doctor. Doctor, hi. It's Ashley from Pfizer. How you doing?
No, thank you. I'm not
No,
interested.
can we just talk about Aldosterone real quick? We can go inside. We'll sit down. It'll be good.
No, thank you.
Please,
I'm not interested.
just a second of your time.
Okay, 1 minute.
Perfect. Thank you.
Tell me about aldaquin. A drug for aldosterone isn't up my top priority.
Why wouldn't it be?
Sure, it's important, but it's just not important enough to spend hospital funds on.
I find that hard to believe. Aldosterone is the most important hormone in the body.
Sure, it's important enough, but I wouldn't say most important.
Let me prove you wrong.
All right.
So I'm sure you know how aldosterone works, but we'll recap.
Let's first look at how aldosterone works in the bodies.
It all starts at the adrenal cortex, the outer layer of the adrenal gland that rests on top of the kidneys. The gland produces 4 other cholesterol-derived hormones, aldosterone being the most important. It's impossible to live without aldosterone as it's the most essential to human life, making it the most vital chemical in the body's endocrine system.
Aldosterone was first isolated in 1953 by Simpson and Tate. It is a 4-ring structure that is derived from cholesterol and is produced in the outermost region of the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa. Inside the glandular tissue of the adrenal cortex, the P450 side chain cleavage enzyme converts cholesterol into pregnenolone, which also occurs in the synthesis of all other hormones of the adrenal cortex. However, aldosterone synthase is only located in the zona glomerulosa and is the vital enzyme that functions in forming aldosterone. Because it is lipid-based, aldosterone can freely cross the plasma membrane of cells into the nucleus and bind to its receptor. This eliminates the need for membrane-bound receptors and secondary messengers such as cyclic AMP that are required for the functioning of other hormones. Now that we've learned about the gland and the structure of aldosterone, let's move on to how the body stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete this hormone.
It's stimulated in response to a number of stimuli, primarily angiotensin II, but can also involve ACTH, high serum potassium ion levels, low serum sodium ion levels, plasma acidosis, and a decrease in blood pressure detected by the baroreceptors of the atria.
The most influential stimulus of aldosterone secretion is the increase in blood concentration of angiotensin II. When the kidneys detect a drop in filtrate levels due to a decrease in blood pressure, the juxtaglomerular cells of the nephron in the kidneys secrete renin. Renin will convert angiotensinogen, which was secreted by the liver, into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I will then be converted into angiotensin II by angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs. Once angiotensin II is in the blood, it will work to raise blood pressure through stimulation of the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, the most important part of our body's response to increased blood pressure.
Once aldosterone is released into the bloodstream, it will work to reabsorb sodium in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts. It does so by increasing expression of sodium and potassium and ATPases on the interstitial wall and sodium channels of the epithelial lining. The increase in the sodium channels on the luminal wall allows for passive transport of sodium ions from the filtrate into the cells. This passive transport occurs due to the negative transmembrane potential maintained by the sodium and potassium ATPases, which have also been upregulated. However, the potassium channels that are also located on the luminal side allows for the passive diffusion of potassium ions out of the cell into the filtrate when the sodium ions enter. Thus, the net effect of aldosterone is to increase serum concentrations of sodium while decreasing potassium, and the presence of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary, which is also stimulated by the angiotensin-renin system, the water in the lumen of the nephron will also be reabsorbed. This is because the reabsorbed sodium will cause an increase in osmolality of the blood, and the water will flow down its concentration gradient.
In summary, the primary effect of aldosterone is to induce sodium and fluid retention, resulting in intravascular volume increase and potassium excretion. This is done through stimulation of cytoplasmic mineralocorticoid receptors in distal renal tubular cells, increasing activity and number of epithelial sodium channels, promoting unidirectional transepithelial sodium transport.
So tell me more about the health problems associated with aldosterone.
There are many diseases that arise from aldosterone. The most common are Addison's disease and Cohen syndrome.
Addison's disease arises from the inability to produce aldosterone in sufficient quantities. It occurs because the immune system attacks the adrenal cortex, developing issues with mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens produced there.
Cohen syndrome occurs from primary hyperaldosteronism, or the overproduction of aldosterone due to issues with the gland itself. Secondary hyperaldosteronism occurs from the overproduction of aldosterone that may occur because of other issues such as the overproduction of renin.
So tell me more about Cone syndrome.
Jerome Cohen was the first to describe the syndrome of autonomous and excessive secretion of aldosterone. Termed Cone syndrome, it can also be referred to as primary hyperaldosteronism. It is associated with development and progression of hypertension, congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, chronic kidney disease, and metabolic syndrome. The index case during Cohen's research was a young woman presenting with severe hypertension or abnormally high blood pressure, profound hypokalemia, or potassium ion deficiency, and a pronounced metabolic alkalosis or alkaline blood due to metabolism rather than respiration.
Recent studies estimate that primary hyperaldosteronism is prevalent in 5 to 10% of the general hypertensive population and about 20% of patients with severe or resistant hypertension. The classical effect of excess aldosterone causes excessive volume retention, contributing directly to hypertension, cardiac output, intracardiac volumes, and glomerular filtration rate. Increased blood pressure, in turn, increases risk of stroke, heart disease, and chronic kidney disease. Increased intracardiac volume in conjunction with hypertension would increase risk of developing heart failure as well as development of arrhythmias.
Recent studies show that primary hyperaldosteronism contributes not only to development and severity of hypertension, but to resistance of antihypertensive treatment as well. Comparisons of patients with primary hyperaldosteronism and primary hypertension suggest that cardiovascular complications are more common in those with primary hypertension. One report suggests that those with primary hyperaldosteronism were 4 times as likely to have a stroke, 6.5 times as likely to have a myocardial infarction, and 12 times more likely to develop atrial fibrillation.
Testing for Cone syndrome is reliably screened by the measurement of aldosterone-renin ratio. This test is recommended for patients with hypokalemia, resistant hypertension, history of severe hypertension, risk of having a secondary cause of hypertension, and incidental adrenal mass.
Well, how does aldactone work to combat Cone syndrome?
The active drug in aldactone is spironolactone.
It works by binding to mineralocorticoid receptors located in the distal collecting tube and collecting ducts of the nephrons in the kidney. By binding to these receptors, it acts as an antagonist to the hormone aldosterone.
With the receptors bound competitively, the aldosterone is still able to bind to mineralocorticoid receptors. However, the response to hormone secretion is decreased. It's important to note that it is impossible to survive without aldosterone, as it is our body's main regulation for ion concentrations, including the ions used by our neurons to send impulses. Aldactone allows the aldosterone to do its job. However, by inhibiting a portion of the receptors, the reabsorption of sodium in water is decreased.
Like other aldosterone antagonists, such as thiazides, aldactone does not increase potassium excretion. Rather, it decreases it. Aldactone also helps prevent cardiac fibrosis, which can be caused by aldosterone.
Thank you. I'm very interested in your product. Contact my secretary.
Thanks.
I gotta get back to my patients.